Hello, everybody, and welcome back to the Global Gaming Business Podcast. As always, I'm your host, Jess Marquez, and our guest today is Richard Bayliss, Director of Product Compliance and Safer Gambling at Playtech, to talk about his experience at the UK Gambling Commission, the evolution of gambling regulation, and how Playtech keeps compliance at the forefront of its growth plans. As online gaming giant Playtech continues its expansion into North America and beyond, compliance and responsible gambling are central to its efforts. Leading the charge in this department is Richard Bayliss, who came to the company after more than a decade on the UK regulatory side. Bayliss has seen both Playtech and the regulators it works with change dramatically over the years, and the speed of change has never been faster. He and I spoke in Las Vegas at UNLV's International Conference on Gambling and Risk-Taking in May. We are here on the first day of the UNLV Gambling and Risk-Taking Conference. I wish I knew the number off the top. I think it's like the 13th or the 17th or something. We're here in beautiful Las Vegas. Not a very far drive for me, but a very far journey indeed for our guest, Richard Bayliss today. How are you doing, sir?
Yeah, I'm very well, thanks, Jess. Thanks for speaking to me.
So, for those who may not know, you've been with Playtech for about 10 years now, right?
Yes, yeah, 8.5 years at
Sure.
Playtech.
And before then, you actually came from the regulatory side with the UK Gambling Commission, correct?
Yes, yeah, I joined the UK Gambling Commission in, well, December 2006. So 11 years of experience at the regulator, 8.5 with Playtech.
So how did that come to be? How did you get into the gambling industry in general, and then like kind of specifically on the regulatory side?
I think like most people by chance,
Sure,
I
hit.
saw an interesting job
Sure.
advert for a 10-month contract.
Yeah,
Joined the Gambling Commission when they were licensing the industry for the first time
I
in,
was
in
just about to say.
2007.
Yeah,
And it really found it interesting, fascinating topic, how you balance regulation with, business activity, how you protect players, do all those different things, how, integral, betting integrity is to sports, like so many different, interesting facets of it. Yeah, never left, never wanted to leave. It's really interesting.
so when take me back to that time, that era when you started in kind of the mid-aughts. What was the kind of industry outlook at that time, like when you first started, and kind of how did that evolve over the course of your time at the commission?
Well, at that time, regulation was very new. So
Sure.
Italy had regulated its market more on a point of consumption basis. The UK, well, Great Britain regulated it on a point of supply.
Okay.
So, it still allowed this idea that if you were based in Europe, you could serve the British market from
Interesting.
offshore without a license. But regulation was brand new for all the operators. It's really the first time a lot of them had been regulated and had been required to be regulated. So, the principle at that time was if you had equipment based in Britain, you must have a license. Um, you could base yourselves offshore in Gibraltar, Alderney, Isle of Man, or Europe, and still serve the British market. But if you were here in Britain, you were licensed and had to meet UK requirements.
So when you transitioned over to the industry and joining Playtech, kind of tell me about that transition, kind of what brought that on, what made you want to leave the commission and specifically kind of go into the industry side.
Yeah, like I say, I mean, my job at the commission sort of straddled regulator and industry, so I was trying to be a translation layer between the two.
Sure.
So, trying to get across what the challenges that the industry faces, but also explain to operators and suppliers in the industry why the commission is doing what it is. They've got challenges, they've got licensing objectives to meet, and they're quite broad. And like everyone, there's pressure. You're driven to adopt certain policies or implement certain policies for a variety of factors. Some of it is down to what you're seeing as a regulator. Some of it is because of the mood around gambling. And so I hadn't thought about leaving, and then Playtech approached me. Interesting company in the supplier space. You know, ability to influence not just in their own business but elsewhere as well, and a global business as well. So moving away from just the British market, which I knew well, to the challenge of looking at how regulations evolved and developing in other markets too.
Was there any sort of um, I'm sure was there any kind of sense when you joined that there was kind of like, oh, this guy that we've been meeting with for so long and coordinating with, and now in some ways probably fighting against in some aspects of it, and then now he's on our team, and now he's kind of fighting for us. Was that kind of a did you have that kind of sense at all, or was it more natural than that?
No, not really. I mean, I hope Playtech approached me because they understood that I know the
Sure.
gambling regulatory market. I'm not going to argue for things that are indefensible.
Hmm.
What I do want is good regulation that protects people and supports business. And they don't have to be mutually exclusive. I think if you get the balance right, then you can have proper protections in place, um, and an interesting, innovative gambling market, which you know it is constantly changing. People enjoy gambling. You know, they often gamble in small amounts. We're here in Vegas where it's on a wholly different
Sure.
scale to what we see in the UK. But you know, people enjoy having a bet on sports. They enjoy playing slot games or poker, um, and they can do so safely. But it has responsibility on operators to support that. So it isn't just the regulator designing regulations. It's the operators taking those and trying to make them work for their business. They know their players best. So how do they apply them in practice?
So all your years between regulating the industry and participating in it, are you a gambler yourself? Do you have any games you like to play, any bets you like to make, or are you abstain?
Well, I'd never gambled until I joined the Gambling Commission, and I thought, well, if I'm going to be involved in regulating, I need
Sure.
to understand what gambling is. So I
Sure.
never even played the lottery at that point. But yeah, I mean, don't sports, and it shows how you know the presentation earlier about skill,
Hmm.
and watch loads of football, loads of soccer, but how often can I predict the winner of a game, let alone the correct score? It does keep it interesting, but there's so many factors that you know you'd love to be able to predict the results, but yeah, occasionally have a bet, and yeah, in Vegas, seeing the slots, and
Sure.
yeah, it's just a very, very different climate. So I think you can understand why the attraction of Vegas is you come here for a trip, book your flights, pay for your hotel, you've got a budget for gambling, you stick to that hopefully,
Hmm.
and enjoy the experience, and then go home. And a lot of people don't then gamble, do they? So,
So if we look at your tenure with Playtech now, specifically, kind of how would you describe your role within the business, at your current role, and kind of how has the company or your experience with the company kind of evolved over that time? Because it's kind of interesting. So it's kind of been an equal split, like a decade on the regulatory side and a decade on the industry. So how has the industry side of it evolved for you since you started?
yeah, it has changed rapidly. So I think
Yeah.
you know early days there was very slow incremental change, but I
Sure.
think in the last few years, when I joined Playtech, we had a handful of licenses in different markets
Mm.
because not many countries had regulated at that point. Now we're up to 38 licenses in 38 different countries all over the globe. We're very diverse in the markets that we serve, so that has changed, and just the proliferation of different requirements that has
Sure.
been really interesting. That's probably the biggest change, that we went from maybe regulators being influenced by one another and maybe making a few changes, adopting certain requirements to suit local circumstances.
Mm.
But I think in the last few years, we've seen lots and lots of different approaches. Some are very hands off, others are very interventionist, and those can change quite rapidly. So the pace of change of regulation has been a surprise. Just how quickly a regulator will move on from a policy that
Sure.
they don't feel is working, and all the problems that then creates for the industry, that you've adapted once and you've now got to make more changes to meet the new requirements.
So, and that pertains to both like mature markets or existing markets, and also all the new markets that have been stood up in recent years.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, mature markets kind of a different issue.
Mm.
It's potentially harder to make changes where you've got a lot of sort of regulatory and compliance and tech legacy. You've built things that you know were intended to work with the regulation that you had at the time, and that's where the interesting challenge in the day-to-day job is how we support the regulatory changes within the business. Make sure that we are ready for deadlines for new markets. We want to be really early into the market. We want Playtech to be there from day one when a market opens up, and that means being really flexible on how we develop our software, how we develop the platform, making sure we can compete. And part of that competition now is about being flexible and being able to adopt change and implement it quickly, effectively, and ensuring it's compliant.
How does those processes, like, so all of the work that goes into getting ready for a market or to enter a market versus once you're live, how would you kind of categorize those two processes? Are they similar, or is it completely one and then different to the other?
I mean, they have to be linked. They are very distinct.
Okay.
But that first part of preparing for the market is it's about intelligence. It's understanding what the climate is like.
Hmm.
You know, are the local peculiarities that you need to adopt in the business? What's the motivation of the regulator? What challenges have they been set by their government or the legislators that are driving the regulation? It's important to know what the intent of requirements is, because that then informs you in the next phase when you're looking to develop your solution to a particular regulation. In lots of cases, because we're in so many markets, we can take something that's already been developed
Mm.
and lift it and either make small changes or no changes, and it's compliance. But where you've got these new regulations, new requirements, understanding what the regulator and the politicians are expecting is really important, because you have to get it right.
Now that you've been around for a lot of this expansion and you've have obviously so much experience with so many different markets and regulators, do you notice any, and to be clear, I want to preface that this is not at all intended to be a criticism of regulators or to be derogatory to them, but have you noticed any trends in terms of, like, are regulators maybe behaving the same way that they did in the past, or do you find that kind of as expansion grows, or like as the number of markets grows and all these new regulators are kind of forming themselves up, do you think that they kind of are becoming more like each other, or there's just kind of a randomness to these regulators that you're seeing?
Yeah, I mean, regulators have a really complex job.
Sure.
They've got to balance so many competing priorities, competing demands from all the different stakeholders. But yeah, in some areas, there is harmonization, probably the wrong word from a European context.
Sure.
But we are seeing in tools, perhaps, kind of the wider adoption of a certain suite of RG tools,
Hmm.
say for gambling tools. But there is always an anomaly. So, it seems to be that each newly regulated market is, introducing like a reasonable subset of new requirements,
Hmm.
which again, is difficult because does anyone know how they work? From a platform perspective, do we know how to develop them? Do we know how to test them? Um, but also from the regulator perspective, do you know what you're going to get from this? It might sound like a strong requirement to have,
Hmm.
but when it's released, will it have the effect that you want? So, we are interested in how you evaluate changes. Would like to see, following the evidence more, following the research when you're designing new policy, because it has a really big impact. We, we share the goals with regulators that we want a safe, fair, responsible market, but there are things that make that difficult. So if industry misunderstands what the regulator wants, and regulators introduce requirements that don't really benefit players, they don't protect them in the way that they thought they would. That's is one area where regulators maybe aren't looking at what others have done
Sure.
and being sort of critical of, will this work in my market? Yeah.
What are some of, when you are thinking of tailoring, compliance and RG initiatives to specific markets or maybe regions more broadly, what are some of the factors that you are considering? I'm assuming obviously must be partly what the regulator is telling
Yeah.
you. That's probably the easiest one, but there's also player dynamics, there's other dynamics. But what are some of the other dynamics that you consider?
Yeah, so the regulation is really non-negotiable.
Sure.
Once it's drafted, it's there. But
Right.
after that, it's trying. It's using all the intel you've got to understand the market. So, operators that are going to use the tools, it's really important to get their view on it, because, they'll have, in most cases, had relationships with players through, non-remotes, bricks and mortar, or they may have done, business in other markets that are similar. So, yeah, how do you speak to players? You won't speak to a US player in the same way that you would to one in the UK. We're kind of same language, lots in common, but also the approaches to it are very, very different. I think much more in the US it's about freedom of choice, isn't it? And players will expect to be able to choose what they want to do, not directed in how they spend their money gambling by an operator or a regulator. So yeah, that's important one for us. Products also important. Are there any local games that you don't have in your suite of products? Themes are quite different across different markets. Sure. We see Latin America's got a very different sort of demand on games than Europe. So Brazil means that you've got a critical mass in that market where suppliers are looking for Brazil and LATAM specific content, whereas previously it was maybe less less variance across some of the European markets. We're starting to see different content that be more localized now for different markets.
If you look ahead, I don't want to frame this in a way, so I want to think about the kind of the biggest opportunity and the biggest challenge. But I guess maybe more specifically, or put it another way, what is the thing that when you think about your work and your role that you that maybe worries you the most or stresses you the most, or maybe the thing that you sit at night and you think, oh man, this is just like at the top of my mind, and then conversely, the other thing that is like the thing that gives you the most excitement, the most optimism, or the thing that you look and say, this is a really big opportunity that we have here. Does anything come to mind?
Yeah, I mean, it's a really dynamic market, which is why it's always it's such a dynamic industry and sector, always something different. So it's both the challenge and the thing that scares you is
Sure.
how quickly will things change. How many different markets can you manage regulatory change for at the same time? Opening lots of markets at the same time, or huge consultations that go through which require massive changes. How does a business compete with all those things going on? You want to be able to innovate, but also you've got these kind of non-negotiables, which is having maintaining a license. You need to comply, and that's first and foremost. It's then what you do around making your products more exciting, adapting to new sort of consumer trends. Yeah, meeting the demand and continuing to innovate when you have got lots of reg requirements that you can't avoid.
Certainly, certainly. Well, this has been great, Richard. Thank you so much. Is there anything else? I mean, this will be published after the conference is over, but we're sitting here at the very beginning of it. Is there anything else that this week that you're looking forward to, or that you're really excited about?
I mean, it's always just interesting to hear different perspectives. It's a really broad conference. There's
Sure.
so many people from so many different backgrounds, different countries. Always learn something on this, and build up relationships, because the things that particularly interested for here are use of technology, how you protect players, and people's experience from different markets is always useful for us to take back, and gives us some of that intel that's important to to meet the expectations of different jurisdictions.
Definitely, definitely. Well, thank you again, sir, and best of luck to you.
Thanks very much.
We thank you for joining us on this episode of the Global Gaming Business Podcast. To learn more about Richard, Playtech, and all things gaming, head to ggbmagazine.com. Don't miss an episode of the GGB podcast by subscribing on Apple, Spotify, and wherever you get your podcasts. Thanks, and we'll see you next time.